Comic books are full of daring action and high stakes, but they also get into some pretty weird stuff. Here are the messed up parts of these superhero stories that we all just usually ignore. Everyone these days knows Tony Stark as the wealthy industrialist who fights evil as the invincible Iron Man. If you were only reading comics for about 5 minutes back in 1996, though, you'd know Tony as a teenager who traveled through time to replace his older self after the elder Stark was mind-controlled into becoming a murderer. When that shocking twist was revealed, old Tony went berserk and shoved his hand through his younger self's chest. Then he finally came to his senses and sacrificed his own life to save teen Tony. The result was that we all got a cool new 90s teen version of Iron Man who thought crime while attending high school, hopefully taking some tips from the older Tony's mistakes.
Don't do anything I would do, and definitely don't do anything I wouldn't do. There's a little gray area in there, and that's where you operate.
While the move was meant to breathe some new life into the character and entice new readers, it didn't exactly catch on. Teen Tony and his exaggerated anime-inspired armor managed to stick around for only 8 issues before he sacrificed himself yet again. After that, he was rebooted along with the rest of the Avengers and the Fantastic Four on a parallel Earth, and then a year later was rebooted back into the regular Marvel Universe. The weirdest part? Tony actually remembers all this stuff, including 3 different childhoods. And you wonder why he drank. Still, it's nice to know that if Robert Downey Jr. ever gets tired of playing Iron Man in the movies, there's actually precedent for replacing him with one of those kids from Riverdale. One sad fact of comics is that, like a lot of media, they lagged behind in reflecting the real world, especially when it came to including characters of different races. As time went on, creators started diversifying their casts, but in the Superman books, they hit a bizarre snag with a pretty upsetting solution. The problem was the planet Krypton. While readers had seen plenty of stories set on Superman's home planet before it exploded, the lack of diversity on the page meant that it seemed to be an entire planet of outer space Caucasians. Rather than just going forward with new stories that would show Krypton as a planet with varied ethnicities that would be similar to Earth's, which seems like a pretty simple solution, the creators came up with an explanation for why we hadn't seen any black Kryptonians. They lived on their own segregated island we'd never seen before. Vaflo Island made its first appearance on a map of Krypton that referred to it as the home of a highly developed black race, who had the same scientific achievements as the rest of their planet. Looking back, it's easy to say their hearts were in the right place, but as modern-day Superman writer Mark Waid said, the whole thing is pretty embarrassing. Before he moved to Metropolis and started fighting evil as an adult, Clark Kent patrolled the skies of Smallville as Superboy. That raises a question, though. When did he switch to Superman? Dig through some back issues and you'll find the answer. It was when he lost his virginity to a woman who had been brainwashed by a robot teacher from space that his dad made. Obviously. There are only a couple of stories about Teacher, a Kryptonian robot made by Superman's dad that was meant to guide little Kal-El and make sure he knew about his home planet, but one of them goes way too far. Thanks to the robot's meddling, a classmate named Misty was able to figure out Clark's secret identity. She revealed her discovery right before they shared a passionate embrace, which led to the next panel where Ma and Pa Kent mentioned that Clark's bed hadn't been slept in the night before. It turned out the entire thing was orchestrated by the teacher to find out what would happen if Clark had to watch someone he loved die right in front of him, which in Misty's case happened when she was brained with a rock thrown by a Sasquatch. Classic teaching method. Clark managed to avoid the temptation to take revenge on Bigfoot, and the teacher determined that he was ready to be called a man. The good news is that Misty's death was faked, but the bad news is that she was being mind-controlled through the whole relationship before having her memory erased. Needless to say, this story was never mentioned again. Believe it or not, Supergirl has had even worse luck in the romance department than her cousin. How bad? Well, back in the Silver Age, she wound up dating a horse without even knowing it. To her, he was Bronco Bill Starr, a rodeo rider so skilled that, as Supergirl herself said, he was almost part of the horse. Which part? We'll leave that up to you. It turned out, however, that Bill wasn't Bill at all. He was actually Supergirl's own pet steed, Comet, who had been turned into a human thanks to a sort of magical reverse werewolf curse. And just to add another weird layer to it, Comet wasn't actually a horse either. He was a centaur named Byron who had been exiled to space back in Hercules' time and cursed by Circe, whom you may remember from the Odyssey. The thing is, he never tells Supergirl any of this, instead keeping it a secret so he can date her as Bronco Bill for a few days, which is a pretty creepy way for a horse to act.
The creepiest days are when you don't hear from the horse at all.
The qualifications for who got to join the 30th century teenagers as the Legion of Superheroes always seemed pretty arbitrary, which is exactly what you'd expect from a bunch of kids deciding who got to be in their special club. In fact, every time they held auditions for new members, they wound up rejecting a handful of wannabes. But none were more messed up than the one we saw in the pages of Secret Origins number 46. That issue is mostly known for featuring Arm Fall Off Boy, a hero who does exactly what his name says. But it also introduced readers to Fortress Lad. He had the ability to turn into a giant metal fortress and was rejected because the Legionnaires didn't think he'd be that useful. They were wrong, though. When another reject erased their memories and threatened to blow them away with a laser pistol, he protected them. And here's where it gets disturbing. The villain of the story wound up erasing Fortress Lad's memory completely, leaving him unable to turn himself back into his human form, or even remember he was once human at all. Then, she died before she could restore the Legionnaires' memories of the other applicants. The Legion just assumed they'd found a new clubhouse and promptly started making renovations inside something that had once been, and still was, a living being. Killing a beloved character can be a tough trick for a comic to pull off at the best of times, but Hal Jordan might have gotten the worst death a superhero has ever had. After his hometown of Coast City was destroyed by the cyborg Superman while the real Superman was busy being dead, long story, Hal snapped. Driven by a desire to undo the tragedy, he turned on the Green Lantern Corps, went on a murder spree to collect their rings, and then used this power to try rewriting time itself as a supervillain called Parallax. The next few decades saw Jordan being replaced by a new character, dying, briefly serving as the undead embodiment of the literal wrath of God, and then finally returning to the role of Green Lantern again. In order to reclassify him as a good guy, Parallax was retconned into being something other than just a name Hal thought sounded cool when he started serial murdering his coworkers. Instead, it was now a giant yellow space cockroach made of fear that possessed Hal in his darkest moments, controlling his actions. With Parallax removed, he was back in action, with no one really worrying that maybe a guy who started killing people because of a space bug wasn't all that stable to begin with. Harley Quinn isn't exactly a superhero, but her overwhelming popularity means that over the past 20 years, she's been treated as a protagonist far more often than she's been a straight-up villain. She's always been characterized as a sympathetic character whose genuine love for the Joker allowed him to manipulate her into a life of crime. But while it's easy to identify with someone who followed her heart down the worst possible path, it gets a little more difficult when she starts blowing up children in a large-scale terrorist attack without any involvement from the Joker.
We're bad guys. It's what we do.
After getting out of the Suicide Squad, Harley winds up on a crime spree that involves blowing up a police station and everyone in it, and that's just where it starts. The real crime comes a few pages later, when she distributes dozens of free video games to the families of Gotham City and then watches without emotion as they explode at her command. All told, there were 19 explosions that happen on the page, and it's implied that there were a whole lot more. Sympathetic or not, blowing up a couple of dozen families makes it pretty hard to like somebody. Batman is well known as a hero who's prepared for any situation, up to and including an exploding shark. But it turns out there are some things that go beyond even the Dark Knight's understanding, and one of them is the internet. After returning from a time travel adventure where everyone presumed he was dead, that's another long story, Bruce Wayne decided to reinvent global information technology. He called it Internet 3.0, a World Wide Web that would be under the protection of Barbara Gordon, the former Batgirl who had reinvented herself as the ultra hacker known as Oracle. Batman even gave her a digital avatar with special cheat codes and anti-malware technology so they could battle against cybercrimes. And if that sounds like a bunch of random words from a hacking scene in one of those cop shows for old people, well, that's about how it worked out.
Oh, this is not good.
It turned out that with this new world of virtual museums, department stores, and schools, Batman basically just invented Second Life about 8 years after we had it in the real world. The only big innovation? If you died on Internet 3.0, you died in real life. Maybe stick to personalized boomerangs and rocket cars, Batman. One of the problems of having a shared universe is that it raises a lot of questions. If they live in the same world, for instance, then there's a chance Superboy could have stopped Batman's parents from being murdered if he knew it was going to happen, which he did. In a story published back in 1960, Thomas Wayne moved to Smallville to work as the town's resident doctor and brought his son Bruce along with him. Even at that young age, Bruce's knack for fighting crime was evident, and he wound up taking on some bad guys while disguised as the Flying Fox, which of course is a kind of bat. Rather than dissuading him from such a dangerous hobby, Clark Kent was happy to team up with him because his time telescope showed him that Bruce grew up to be Batman. Armed with this knowledge, Superman was perfectly happy to let the Waynes die because it meant he got to have a friendly coworker in the future. Yikes! Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.